When I first saw her standing in my kitchen, quietly folding the towels I had just washed, I didn't suspect a thing. Not once did I imagine that the woman I thought was just my new maid was really the last piece of a secret my late husband left behind, one that would shatter the life I had tried so hard to build after his death. I still remember that morning clearly. The sunlight slanted through the window, warm and gentle, dust motes floating in the air like tiny ghosts of the past. I was in my favorite worn armchair by the window, nursing my coffee, still numb from the events that had brought her here. My house was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where I could grieve and heal. Instead, it was turning into a prison of whispered truths and hidden betrayals. It all started when the lawyer's call came, a call that should have been straightforward but wasn't. My husband, David, had died suddenly, leaving behind what I thought was a tidy estate and a clear will. I was convinced I had lost everything except the peace that came from knowing the man I loved was finally at rest. But peace, I learned, was the last thing I would find. Before I go any further, let me take you back a little to the life I had before everything came crashing down. David and I had been married for nearly 15 years. We met young, in that sweet, unpolished way that made the world seem simple. Our home was modest but warm. I remember the smell of his morning coffee mixing with the crisp pages of his newspaper. He had this habit of humming softly when he thought no one was listening. It was a small thing, but it made me feel safe. Our mornings were routine but comforting. David would leave for work early, his briefcase in one hand, his wallet and keys jingling in the other. I'd be in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner or preparing breakfast. The sound of his footsteps on the porch always gave me a flutter of anticipation even after all those years. We had no children, but our life was full in its own way. Sunday dinners with his family, quiet evenings watching old movies, and the occasional weekend getaway to the lake. I never doubted him. Not once. He was my rock, my confidant. So when the housekeeper I'd hired last month, a soft-spoken woman named Lila, appeared one afternoon in the living room with an envelope in her trembling hands, my heart skipped. Lila had been quiet, efficient, and unobtrusive. She arrived early, stayed late, and always left without a word. I had barely thought about her beyond the relief of having someone else handle the never-ending chores. But that afternoon, as she approached me hesitantly, I sensed a shift, a quiet tension that didn't fit the calm rhythm I had grown used to. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something about David." Her words landed like a stone in a still pond. It wasn't just what she said, but the way she said it, the hesitation, the fear, the shame wrapped around each syllable. She looked at me, not as a servant might look at an employer, but as a person who had been carrying a burden far too heavy for too long. As she handed me the envelope, I noticed the faint scent of lavender on her wrists, the same scent David used to wear sometimes. I took the envelope with trembling hands, my mind racing. Inside were photographs, intimate, undeniable. Pictures of David and Lila holding hands, sharing meals, quiet moments captured in shadowy corners of cafes and parks. And then, the paper's documents I wasn't prepared for. A marriage certificate, signed, dated, legal. David had a secret wife. I sat back, the world spinning slightly. How could I have missed this? The late-night phone calls I dismissed as work stress. The little disappearances that never seemed important. The kindnesses from Lila, always a warm smile. An extra cup of coffee made just the way he liked it now took on a whole new meaning. I thought about the times I found messages on his phone that didn't make sense. Strange names, hidden conversations. I pushed them away, telling myself it was nothing. But now, here it was right in front of me. That day marked the beginning of a slow unraveling not just of my marriage, but of the life I thought I knew. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any I had ever experienced. Not just because of the secret marriage, but because of the silence, the lies, and the way I was left alone to piece it all together. I looked at Lila, the woman who had lived quietly under my roof, blending into the background while she held the truth so close. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." Her eyes were full of regret, but I couldn't decide if it was for me, for David, or for the tangled mess of emotions they left behind. As the shock began to dull, questions flooded my mind. What did this mean for his estate? For the life I thought we shared? And, perhaps most painfully, what did it mean for me? The truth was, I had to find out. Not just for the money or the property, but for my dignity, my justice, and the future I still hope to claim. So, I started looking closer at the pieces of our life. Small gestures, hidden clues, and memories I had pushed aside. Each one was a thread leading me deeper into a story I never wanted to hear. The days that followed were a haze of confusion and quiet investigation. I kept Lila around not out of kindness or trust, but because she was the key to everything I needed to understand. She was no longer just a maid. She was a living, breathing reminder of the life David had hidden from me. I watched her closely, noticing the small things I'd missed before. The way she sometimes caught her breath when I entered a room unexpectedly. How her eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and fear when she thought I wasn't looking. She never tried to hide her presence, but she also never offered more than the bare minimum in conversation. I felt like I was living with a ghost, one I couldn't ignore but didn't know how to confront. One evening, after a long day of sifting through papers and trying to contact David's lawyer again, I found myself in the kitchen. The scent of freshly brewed tea was comforting, but the house felt unbearably silent without David's humming. Lila was there, wiping down the counter. She glanced at me, hesitated, then spoke softly. "Can I tell you more?" she asked. I nodded, my throat tight. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear more, or if I was afraid of what the truth might do to me. She told me how she met David years ago, before we were even married, she said, though I doubted that. She described a quiet love, a connection that grew in secret, away from prying eyes. How they married in a small ceremony, far from family, and how David asked her to keep it quiet because of his other responsibilities. She never expected to be a secret forever. She thought after he died, she'd finally be able to claim her place. Listening to her, I felt the weight of every lie, every hidden smile David had given her when he was supposed to be at home with me. The kindnesses I once saw as trivial now burned with a sharper edge gifts left on my desk. Phone calls I overheard but never questioned. The way he always seemed distracted, as if carrying a secret too heavy to bear. I wanted to scream, to shake Lila until she understood what she had done to me. But instead, I stayed quiet, absorbing the pain, letting it sink in. The lawyer confirmed the worst. David's estate was tangled. Lila's marriage was legally binding. She was entitled to a portion of everything. Our home, our savings, the life I had assumed was mine alone to keep. I sat in that lawyer's office, feeling like the ground had slipped away beneath me. The house we had built together, the plans we had made, all shared now with a woman I barely knew who had lived under my roof as if invisible. I realized then that my fight was not just about money or property. It was about reclaiming my dignity. Back at home, I faced Lila again. This time, I didn't hold back. "Why did you stay silent?" I asked. "Why didn't you tell me? Why pretend to be just a maid?" She looked down, voice barely steady. "I was scared," she said. "I thought if you knew you'd hate me. Maybe you would have pushed me out and I'd lose everything." Her honesty was raw and painful, but it didn't excuse the betrayal. I wanted answers. Why keep the secret from me? From everyone. How long had she known about my existence? She told me about the delicate balance David had tried to keep: his roles, his fears, the life he didn't want to destroy. She wasn't the villain, I realized. Neither was he. They were trapped in a web of their own making. But I was the one left picking up the pieces. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. Over the next few weeks, I began my own quiet investigation. I pored over David's phone, his emails, his appointments. I looked for patterns, for moments when his two worlds collided. There were texts I hadn't understood before, simple, "I love you," messages sent late at night, photos tucked away in hidden folders, voice messages where his tone was softer, more tender, when speaking to Lila. Each discovery was a blow, but also a clue, a map that led me to understand the man I loved and the life he tried to live. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch, the sun low and golden. Lila joined me, her presence no longer a threat, but a fragile connection. "I want to help," she said. "Not just for me, but for you too." I looked at her, surprised. In her eyes, I saw not a rival but a woman caught in the same storm. Together, we started to untangle the mess, communicating with the lawyer, discussing the estate, and deciding how to face the family. It was the first time since David's death that I felt a flicker of control. But not everyone was ready for the truth. David's family, once warm and welcoming, grew cold. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some blamed me for the scandal. Others looked at Lila with suspicion and disdain. I stood in the eye of the storm, learning how to navigate the sharp edges of betrayal and loyalty. It wasn't easy. I lost friends. I gained wary allies. And through it all, I learned that strength wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about standing tall when everything tried to pull me down. The first time I faced David's family after everything came to light, I felt like a stranger in my own life. We gathered in the living room of his mother's house, a place that once held nothing but warm memories and Sunday dinners filled with laughter and stories. Now, the air was thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. His mother, Eleanor, sat stiffly on the floral couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look at me when I entered, only at Lila, whose presence seemed to inflame something unspoken. "You should have told us," Eleanor said quietly, but her voice carried a sharp edge. "How could you hide this from us?" Lila's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. I didn't hide it. David asked me to keep it quiet. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I felt a surge of sympathy for her despite everything. Here we were, two women caught in a mess woven by the man we both loved, now lost. David's brother, Michael, paced back and forth, his frustration barely contained. "This is a betrayal to the family," he said, voice rising. "We trusted David, and now we find out he was living a lie." I looked at him, steady and calm, though inside my heart was pounding. "Michael, this isn't just about David's choices. It's about the truth. And the fact is, Lila was married to him. She has a right to be here." The room fell silent. It was the first time someone stood up not just for Lila, but for honesty. That night, as I lay awake in the quiet of my home, the weight of everything settled heavily on me. I thought about David not just as the man I loved, but as a flawed human being who made impossible choices. I thought about the woman who shared his secrets, and about the family who felt betrayed. And I thought about me. Who was I now? After all this, in the weeks that followed, the legal battles began. David's will was contested, the estate tangled in layers of claims and counterclaims. The house I had called home was suddenly a battlefield, but I refused to be just a victim. With Lila's reluctant support, I pushed for transparency and fairness. We worked with the lawyer to draw clear boundaries, to respect what belonged to whom. The process was slow and painful, but necessary. During this time, I discovered small acts of kindness from David that I had dismissed before. The way he always left fresh flowers in the kitchen, even when he was exhausted from work. The notes he wrote to me, tucked away in drawers, sometimes just simple reminders to take care of myself. Sometimes little love letters in his handwriting. Those memories were bittersweet reminders of a man who loved me, but also hid so much. One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes, I found a journal, David's. I hadn't known he kept one. Inside, I found entries filled with struggles, guilt, and hope. He wrote about the impossible choices he had made, the fear of hurting either of us, and the desperate wish that one day, the truth would come out. Reading his words, I felt the full complexity of his heart, flawed, human, torn between love and duty. It was then that I realized something crucial. This story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about understanding, about finding peace with the parts of life that don't have easy answers. The day I decided to confront the truth head-on was the day I invited Lila to sit with me in the living room, the very heart of the house David and I had shared. The air was thick with unspoken words, the fading sunlight casting long shadows on the walls. We were no longer just two women caught in a tragic triangle. We were survivors of the same storm. I looked at her, searching for the woman who had been hidden behind the quiet maid's face. "Lila," I began, my voice steady but soft. "I want to understand everything. Not just the marriage or the money, but you. Who are you? What did he mean to you? And why did you stay silent all these years?" Her eyes glistened with tears, but she met my gaze without flinching. "I never wanted to replace you," she said. "You have to believe me. David was the love of my life. We built something private because the world wasn't ready for it. I thought I was protecting us both." Her voice trembled, but there was a fierce honesty behind it that I couldn't ignore. I felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and something else, a fragile compassion. "How long did you live in the shadows?" I asked. "Too long," she whispered. "I was afraid of losing him completely, afraid of hurting you. So, I stayed quiet, took the role no one saw, the one that wouldn't disrupt the life you built." The weight of her words pressed down on me. All those years of kindnesses, of little favors I'd noticed but dismissed, they were her way of being close to him, even if it meant hiding in plain sight. I thought back to the small clues I had missed or ignored, the times David's phone would buzz softly on the nightstand when I wasn't around, the fleeting glances he gave Lila when she brought him his favorite tea, the extra set of keys she carried, something I'd found odd but never questioned. I realize now that love doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes, it lives in quiet corners, in the spaces between words, in the things left unsaid. After that conversation, Lila and I began to build a fragile truce. We weren't friends, not yet, but we understood that fighting each other wouldn't bring back what we'd lost. Together, we worked with the lawyer to untangle the estate fairly. The house would be sold, the proceeds split. The memories, however, would stay with me. I learned to let go not just of David's secrets, but of the anger and betrayal that threatened to consume me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of amber and rose, I sat alone on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. I thought about the journey I'd been on, the pain, the heartbreak, but also the strength I found in myself. Life, I realized, is messy and complicated. It doesn't always follow the stories we wanted to tell, but in the end, It's about how we rise from the ashes. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. It was time to face the world not as a betrayed widow, but as a woman reclaiming her story. I called a meeting with David's closest friends and business associates. The goal wasn't to expose or shame, but to set the record straight and protect what was rightfully mine. Walking into that room, I felt the familiar tremor of nerves, but also a fierce determination. This was my life, my legacy, and I wasn't going to let secrets rewrite it. David's best friend Mark was the first to speak. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," he said quietly. "David was complicated, but he loved you." His words were a small balm to the raw wound. I looked around the room. Faces I had known for years now held a mix of sympathy and unease. Some had known about Lila, others had been completely in the dark. I spoke calmly, deliberately. David's life was more complicated than I ever imagined. But what matters now is how we move forward with honesty and respect. I also arranged to speak to the staff at the company David had built. It was important they heard the truth from me, not rumors or gossip. Standing before them, I felt a wave of responsibility. "These years haven't been easy," I said. "But I want you all to know that I'm committed to keeping David's vision alive, with transparency and integrity." Their quiet nods were a reminder that even in betrayal, trust can be rebuilt. Throughout this time, I kept an open line with Lila. Our conversations were often difficult, filled with pauses and unspoken regrets, but they were necessary. We shared memories of David, his quirks and dreams, his kindnesses and flaws. It was strange, this fragile bond born out of loss and secrecy, but it was real. One afternoon, as we sat in the sunlit kitchen, Lila surprised me. "I want to help you," she said. "Not just with the estate, but with moving forward. I want to be part of that, if you'll let me." Her words caught me off guard. The woman who had once seemed an intruder was now offering a hand of peace. I looked at her, feeling the weight of months of pain and healing. And I said yes, because sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to forgive not for them, but for yourself. Reclaiming my dignity wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing who I wanted to be after the storm. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping women who had faced betrayal in their own lives. Helping others reminded me that pain is universal, but so is resilience. Each day, I learned to breathe a little easier, to trust a little more, and slowly, I found peace. The news didn't stay a secret for long. Word spread quickly: David's double life, the secret marriage, the contested estate. It was the kind of story people whispered about in grocery stores and coffee shops, sometimes with pity, sometimes with judgment. I felt the eyes of neighbors and acquaintances on me. Some offered quiet condolences, others avoided me like I carried shame. But I held my head high. This was my truth, messy as it was. At the next family gathering, the tension was palpable. David's relatives barely met my gaze. Some treated Lila with cold contempt, while others seemed to struggle between loyalty and disbelief. Eleanor, his mother, approached me quietly. "I never wanted this for any of us," she said, her voice soft but strained. "I'm sorry for how things turned out." Her words, though simple, meant more than any apology could. I nodded, recognizing the shared grief beneath her disappointment. Lila faced her own battles. Friends who once welcomed her now whispered behind her back. Her presence in the community was met with suspicion. Yet, she carried herself with quiet dignity. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only the weight of a woman who had paid a high price for love and secrecy. Despite the upheaval, I made a point to keep things dignified. No public outbursts, no harsh words, just a steady commitment to truth and fairness, because revenge would only trap me in the past. Justice, I realized, was about rising above. As the estate was settled, Lila and I found a balance. We agreed on terms that honored both our losses and futures. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were two women connected by a man who loved us both, imperfectly but truly. The community, slowly, began to accept this new reality. People saw the strength it took to face such betrayal with grace. I received letters from women who had endured similar pain sharing their stories, thanking me for my courage. Their words reminded me I was not alone. Through it all, I held on to one lesson. Life is never simple. People are flawed. Love is complicated. And sometimes, the hardest battles are fought quietly, within ourselves. Months passed, and with each one, I felt a little lighter, though the scars remained. They no longer defined me. Instead, they became part of my story, a chapter I owned with honesty and strength. I moved out of the house David and I once shared. It was too full of memories, both good and bad, and staying there felt like living in the shadow of betrayal. I found a small apartment nearby, a fresh start with just enough space for me and room to breathe. The process of rebuilding my life wasn't easy. Some days were filled with hope, others with grief. But slowly, I began to rediscover parts of myself I had forgotten: the woman beneath the wife, the person beyond the widow. I started volunteering more consistently at the community center, leading support groups for women who had faced loss and betrayal, hearing their stories, sharing my own. I found a connection that mended the loneliness. One afternoon, after a particularly moving meeting, I sat alone on a bench outside the center, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. A young woman approached, hesitating before speaking. "Your story helped me," she said softly. "I thought I was the only one who felt so lost." Her words struck me deeply. It reminded me that healing isn't just about moving forward, it's about lifting others as you rise. Meanwhile, Leela and I had established a fragile but genuine friendship. We met occasionally over coffee, sharing updates about the estate and our lives. She told me about her hopes for the future, a small business she wanted to start, a chance to live openly without fear. I shared my own dreams, including plans to write a book about my experience. Not for pity or fame, but to remind others that, even in the darkest times, there is light. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past. It was about freeing myself from the chains of bitterness. I forgave David not for his mistakes, but for his humanity. I forgave Lila not because she was perfect, but because holding on to anger only weighed me down. And most importantly, I forgave myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for trusting blindly, and for needing time to heal. On quiet evenings, I often reflect on the journey, the pain, the revelations, the struggle, but also the strength, the growth, and the unexpected friendships. Life isn't a perfect story. It's messy, complicated, and beautiful in its imperfections. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a journey filled with heartbreak, discovery, and, ultimately, healing. Losing David was hard enough, but finding out he carried a secret life beneath our own was a wound I never expected to bear. I want you to know this. Sometimes, the people we love are more complicated than we imagine. They carry parts of themselves we may never fully understand. And that's a painful truth. But it's also a reminder that we are all human, flawed, fragile, and trying our best. In the end, what matters is how we respond, how we choose to reclaim our dignity, find justice, and, most importantly, heal. If you've ever felt betrayed, or lost, or unsure of who to trust, know that you're not alone. There is strength in forgiveness, not just for others, but for yourself. And there is power in standing tall. Even when the world feels like it's crumbling, would you have been able to forgive? Could you find peace in a story like mine? I'd love to hear your thoughts, please. Share your experiences or questions in the comments below. Your voice matters. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing for more real-life stories of love, loss, and resilience. Together, we can find hope in even the darkest places. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, your story is not over yet.